Close your eyes and think of ancient Egypt. You're probably picturing golden masks, towering pyramids, and powerful pharaohs who ruled over a mysterious desert empire. For centuries, we've looked at their monuments and wondered who these people actually were. Were they a unique group that developed in total isolation? Were they more closely related to their neighbors in Africa, or did they have deep roots in the Middle East and Europe? For a long time, the answers were buried under layers of bandages and thousands of years of dust because the hot, humid environment of Egyptian tombs is absolutely terrible for preserving DNA. It breaks down, it vanishes, and it leaves scientists with nothing but empty sequences. But thanks to a massive technological breakthrough in genomic sequencing, a team of researchers has successfully extracted and analyzed the DNA of dozens of ancient mummies for the first time in history. The results aren't just surprising. They are a total game-changer that is rewriting the genetic map of the ancient world and proving that the people who built the pyramids weren't exactly who we thought they were. This journey into the past didn't involve a whip or a fedora. It happened in high-tech labs at the Max Planck Institute for the Science of Human History in Germany. For years, the scientific community believed that retrieving high-quality DNA from Egyptian mummies was an impossible task. The embalming chemicals, the high temperatures in the tombs, and the humidity of the Nile Valley were thought to have destroyed any usable genetic material long ago. Previous attempts often resulted in contamination from modern handlers, leading to false conclusions. But by using a method called high-throughput sequencing, which can pick out tiny fragments of authentic ancient DNA from a sea of environmental noise, the team managed to sequence the genomes of 93 mummified individuals from a site called Abusir el-Melek. These people lived over a period of 1,300 years, spanning from the New Kingdom all the way to the Roman era. When the data finally came back, it didn't just give us a snapshot of a few families. It provided a genetic timeline of an entire civilization. The first big shock: the ancient Egyptians were genetically much more similar to populations from the Near East and the Levant than they were to modern Egyptians. We're talking about regions like modern-day Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey. This discovery suggests that the foundations of Egyptian civilization were built by a population that was deeply interconnected with the Mediterranean world and the Middle East long before the Greeks or Romans ever showed up. It challenges the old narrative that Egypt was a closed-off, insular society. Instead, we see a picture of a crossroads, a place where people and genes were flowing back and forth across the Sinai Peninsula for millennia. This genetic signature remained remarkably consistent for over 1,000 years, despite the fact that Egypt was conquered by the Assyrians, the Persians, the Greeks, and the Romans. The people on the ground, the ones working the fields and building the temples, stayed genetically the same even as their rulers changed. But then the story takes another turn. If the ancient Egyptians were closer to the people of the Near East, why do modern Egyptians have a different genetic profile? The DNA evidence found a massive shift that occurred much later in history. Around 1,500 years ago, there was a significant influx of genetic material from sub-Saharan Africa. This means that if you were to travel back to the time of King Tut or Ramses II, the people you'd meet would actually look genetically more like a person from ancient Syria or Anatolia than a typical person living in Cairo today. This discovery is shaking up the field of anthropology because it shows that the modern Egyptian identity is a relatively recent development in the grand scheme of things, shaped by migrations and trade routes that opened up long after the last pharaoh had passed away. To understand how high the stakes are for this research, you have to realize how much controversy has surrounded the origins of the Egyptians. For over 100 years, different groups have tried to claim Egypt's legacy. Some argued they were a strictly African population, others that they were essentially Mediterranean. These debates were often fueled more by politics than by hard data, because the data simply didn't exist. Now, for the first time, we have the biological receipts. The DNA tells a story that is more nuanced than any of the previous theories. It's a story of a robust, stable population that acted as a genetic anchor in the ancient world, maintaining its identity through centuries of upheaval before finally shifting due to later historical events like the expansion of trade networks across the Sahara. The process of getting this DNA was a feat of scientific endurance. The researchers didn't just look at the soft tissue, which is where most of the damage happens. Instead, they targeted the teeth and the dense bones of the inner ear. These parts of the body act like natural time capsules, protecting the DNA from the heat and the chemicals used in mummification. By drilling into these hard structures and using powerful magnets to pull out the tiny strands of genetic code, they were able to reconstruct the lives of people who lived 3,000 years ago. We're not just talking about their ancestry either. This kind of data can reveal what diseases they had, what colors their eyes were, and even if they were lactose intolerant. We are moving from studying ancient Egypt as a vague concept to studying ancient Egyptians as individual human beings. One of the most fascinating details in the study was the lack of genetic impact from famous conquerors like Alexander the Great or the Roman emperors. You might expect that when the Greeks took over and established the Ptolemaic dynasty, the genetic makeup of the population would change drastically. But the DNA says otherwise. Even after hundreds of years of Greek rule, the people of Abusir el-Melek showed almost no change in their genetic ancestry. It suggests that while the elite at the top were changing and speaking new languages, the heart of the population was remarkably resistant to change. They kept their traditions, they kept their families within their own communities, and they stayed true to their ancestral roots. This gives us a new perspective on how conquest actually worked in the ancient world. It was often a change in management, not a replacement of the people. This stability is actually one of the most incredible things about the Egyptian civilization. Think about how many empires have risen and fallen in that region. Most of them leave behind a messy genetic footprint. But the Egyptians had a sense of continuity that lasted for thousands of years. The DNA confirms what the archaeology has always hinted at, that there was a deep, underlying Egyptianness that survived even the most chaotic periods of history. This genetic consistency might be the secret ingredient that allowed their culture to remain so recognizable and uniform for so long. Whether they were building pyramids in the Old Kingdom or temples in the New Kingdom, the genetic fabric holding the society together was the same. But what about that later shift towards sub-Saharan Africa? The researchers believe this was caused by an increase in travel and trade along the Nile and across the Sahara. As the Islamic period began and trade routes became more sophisticated, there was more movement of people from the south into the north. This gradually blended with the existing population, creating the genetic profile we see in modern Egypt today. It's a reminder that history is never static. A population isn't a fixed thing but a moving river that changes as it travels through time. By comparing the ancient DNA to modern samples, scientists are able to see exactly when and where those new branches joined the river. This discovery is also changing how we look at other ancient civilizations. If we were wrong about the genetic origins of the Egyptians, what else are we wrong about? Researchers are now looking at taking these same techniques to sites in Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, and Central America. We are on the verge of a paleogenetic revolution, where we will be able to map the migrations of the entire human race with surgical precision. We won't have to rely on broken pottery or half-erased inscriptions to figure out who moved where. We will be able to follow the breadcrumbs left behind in our own cells. In the case of Egypt, this research is also helping us understand the health and daily lives of the people. By looking at the DNA of the mummies, scientists found evidence of specific pathogens and parasites. They can see how malaria and other diseases moved through the Nile Valley and how the population adapted to them. This creates a much more human version of history. Instead of just looking at the big monuments, we are looking at the health struggles, the diets, and the family structures of everyday people. For example, the DNA can tell if two mummies in the same tomb were actually related, or if they were buried together for other reasons. We're finding siblings, cousins, and distant relatives, allowing us to reconstruct ancient family trees that have been forgotten for 30 centuries. The Abusir el-Melek study is just the beginning. The team is already working on larger samples from different parts of Egypt, including the south. Egypt is a long country, and the environment in the north, near the Mediterranean, is very different from the south, near the border with Sudan. By comparing DNA from the north and south, we will be able to see if there were regional differences in the ancient population. Did the people in the south have more African ancestry than those in the north? Was there a genetic gradient along the Nile? These are the questions that will be answered in the next few years. We are moving toward a high-resolution map of ancient human history that would have been unthinkable just a decade ago. It's also worth considering the ethical side of this research. Working with ancient human remains is a sensitive task. The researchers worked closely with the Egyptian government and followed strict protocols to ensure the mummies were treated with respect. There's a balance to be struck between the desire for knowledge and the need to honor the people who left these bodies behind. By learning their stories through their DNA, we are, in a sense, giving them a voice they haven't had in thousands of years. We are acknowledging their identity and their contribution to the human story. The reaction from the public has been massive. For many people, ancient Egypt is a source of pride and fascination. Discovering that their genetic history is more complex than previously thought can be a lot to process. But it's important to remember that genetics is only one part of identity. The ancient Egyptians were defined by their language, their religion, their art, and their governance. Even if their genes share links with people in the Levant, the culture they built was uniquely their own. This research doesn't take away from the achievements of the Egyptians, it just adds a new, more detailed layer to their story. It shows us that they were a people connected to the world, people who were products of a vast and vibrant regional network. As we look at these genetic maps, we also see the reality of the Great Green, which is what the Egyptians called the Mediterranean Sea. Instead of a barrier, it was a highway. The DNA links between Egypt and the Near East suggest a constant exchange of merchants, craftsmen, and travelers. This explains why we see Egyptian influences in ancient Canaan and Syrian influences in ancient Egypt. They were part of a globalized ancient world that existed long before the modern era. The DNA is simply the biological proof of the cultural exchange we've seen in the archaeological record for years. Think about the implications for the Sea Peoples theory as well. For a long time, historians have talked about a mysterious group of seafaring raiders who supposedly destabilized the Mediterranean at the end of the Bronze Age. If we can sequence the DNA of people from that specific era, we might finally be able to identify who these Sea Peoples really were and where they came from. Did they leave a genetic mark on Egypt, or were they absorbed into the local population? The possibilities for solving ancient mysteries are endless now that we have the key to the genetic vault. But why did it take until the 21st century to get this right? The main reason is the contamination problem. When a mummy is discovered, it's usually handled by dozens of people: archaeologists, museum curators, and researchers. Each of these people leaves behind their own DNA. In the past, older sequencing methods couldn't tell the difference between a 3,000-year-old Egyptian and a 30-year-old graduate student. This led to a lot of bad science. The breakthrough was in developing uracil DNA glycosylase treatments that can specifically identify damage patterns that only occur in ancient DNA. If the DNA doesn't show these specific signs of age, the computers discard it as modern contamination. This level of rigor is what makes the New Egypt data so reliable. It's not just a guess, it's a verified ancient signature. This new evidence also sheds light on the intermediate periods of Egyptian history, those times between the big kingdoms when the central government collapsed and the country was fractured. During these times, people often moved around more, and foreign groups moved into the Nile Valley. By looking at DNA across these transitions, we can see if these periods of chaos resulted in major genetic shifts, or if the local population just hunkered down and waited for things to stabilize. The current data suggests a surprising amount of stability, which means the backbone of Egypt was much stronger than the records of the pharaohs might suggest. For the viewers who love a good mystery, imagine what this means for the royal mummies. While the Abu Sir el-Malek study focused on ordinary people, there is a massive push to get high-quality genomic data from the famous kings and queens in the Cairo Museum. We have the mummies of Ramses the Great, Thutmose III, and Queen Hatshepsut. Once we have their full genomes, we can settle the debates about their physical appearance, their health, and their true relations to each other. We might find out that some pharaohs weren't actually the children of their predecessors, revealing secret palace coups or hidden adoptions. The Game of Thrones in ancient Egypt is about to get a lot more interesting. What's truly inspiring about this discovery is how it brings science and history together. We often think of these as two separate worlds, one focused on lab coats and molecules, the other on dusty stones and old scrolls. But this DNA research proves that you can't have one without the other. The stones tell us the what, but the DNA tells us the who. It's a partnership that is giving us the most accurate picture of the past we've ever had. We are living in a golden age of archaeology, but the most important discoveries aren't being made in the desert. They are being made in the sequencer. As we move forward, the Egyptian model of genetic research is being applied to the rest of Africa. For a long time, the genetic history of the African continent was overlooked in favor of European studies. But now, researchers are looking at ancient remains from West Africa, Ethiopia, and the Congo. We are going to see a massive explosion of knowledge about the migrations that shaped the entire continent. The Egyptian DNA study is the proof of concept that showed it can be done, even in harsh climates. It's opening the door for a much more inclusive and accurate history of the human race. The story of the Egyptian DNA is also a story of persistence. DNA is essentially a digital code stored in a biological format. It's the ultimate hard drive. Even after 3,000 years of heat, decay, and chemicals, enough of that code survived to be read by modern machines. It's a humbling thought. Everything that you are, your eye color, your ancestry, your buried health traits, is recorded in a molecule that can outlast civilizations. The mummies of Abisur el-Melek have been gone for 2,000 years, but their code is back among the living, telling us their story. This research also helps us debunk some of the wilder theories about ancient Egypt. We've all seen the shows that claim the pyramids were built by aliens or some lost, high-tech civilization from Atlantis. By showing that the builders were real people with clear genetic links to the region and the era, we are grounding the history of Egypt in reality. We are honoring the actual humans who did the work. They weren't mysterious beings from another world. They were a resilient, clever, and deeply connected population of humans who used their brilliance to create something that would last forever. And now, thanks to their DNA, we can finally say we know them. It's also interesting to see how this data interacts with the field of linguistics. The ancient Egyptian language belongs to the Afro-Asiatic family, which includes Hebrew, Arabic, and Berber. The DNA findings of a strong connection to the Near East align perfectly with the linguistic evidence. It shows that people, language, and genes were all moving together in a coherent way. This kind of multidisciplinary evidence is the gold standard in science. When the genes, the words, and the artifacts all point to the same conclusion, you know you found the truth. As we look at the results again, let's talk about that moment 1,500 years ago. Why then? Why did the African genetic component increase so much at that specific time? Historians point to the Roman Empire's expansion of trade into the interior of Africa and the subsequent rise of the trans-Saharan trade routes. Slavery was also a factor, unfortunately, as people were moved across the continent against their will. But it was also a story of migration and economic opportunity. The Nile has always been a magnet, drawing people toward its fertile banks. After thousands of years of being a relatively closed system, the gates opened, and the Egypt of the Middle Ages became a true melting pot. This contrast between the stable ancient Egypt and the melting pot of the later periods is a fascinating lesson in history. It shows that isolation can lead to incredible cultural consistency, but connection leads to the diversity we see today. Both have their place in the story of a nation. The DNA evidence doesn't say one period is more Egyptian than the other. It simply records the change. It's a scientific testament to the fact that change is the only constant in human history. For those of us watching from the outside, this discovery is a reminder to always be ready to update our worldview. The things we knew for certain in the 90s, that mummy DNA was impossible to sequence or that the Egyptians were a totally isolated group, have been overturned by better technology and more careful research. It's the beauty of the scientific method. We don't just find the truth and stop. We keep digging until we find a deeper truth, and then we dig some more. Looking ahead, the next decade is going to be a whirlwind for Egyptian studies. We are already hearing about new projects that involve using AI to analyze the patterns in the DNA. AI can spot subtle genetic markers that human researchers might miss, helping us identify specific tribes or even villages that the mummies came from. We might be able to map the entire population of the Nile Valley, century by century, showing how people moved from the delta to the deserts and back again. The grand tour of Egypt isn't over. It's just moving into the digital realm. So the next time you see a picture of the Great Pyramid or a golden coffin, remember the people of Abusur el-Melek. Remember that their DNA survived through the ages to tell us that they were a people of the world, a people connected to the Levant and the Near East, a people who remained unchanged through 1,000 years of war and conquest. And remember that the modern world they eventually became is a vibrant blend of those ancient roots and later African influences. The DNA has spoken, and it has told a story that is far richer and more complex than anything we could have imagined. Ancient Egypt is no longer a mystery. It's a living, it's a living, breathing part of our global family tree. As the data starts to pour in from more sites, we are seeing that the Abusir effect is likely a national story. While regional differences will surely exist, The core message remains. The ancient Egyptians were a sophisticated, interconnected Mediterranean population. This changes the way we teach history, the way we design museum exhibits, and the way we think about human ancestry. We are moving away from simple categories and toward a braided version of history, where different groups are constantly weaving in and out of each other's stories. The power of DNA is its objectivity. It doesn't care about our politics or our modern biases. It just is. And in the case of Egypt, it is telling us that the cradle of civilization was built by a people who were deeply integrated into the wider world. It's a powerful lesson in an era where we often try to draw lines between people. 4,000 years ago, those lines didn't exist in the way we think they did. The Mediterranean wasn't a boundary, it was a bridge. And as we continue to cross that bridge through science, who knows what else we will find? Maybe the DNA of a common laborer will reveal that he traveled from Turkey to help build the Valley of the Kings. Maybe a mummy from a small village will show us that some families lived in the same spot for 2,000 years without ever moving. Each individual genome is a book, and we've only just finished reading the preface. The rest of the library is still waiting for us. So, stay curious and keep an eye on those journals. The story of ancient Egypt is being rewritten in real time, and every single one of us is invited to watch it happen. The DNA has changed what we know, but it hasn't changed the wonder. If anything, knowing the true identity of these people makes their achievements even more impressive. They were humans, just like us, navigating a complex world and leaving behind a legacy that has captivated the imagination of every generation that followed. Now we finally know who they were, and knowing that makes the golden masks and the towering pyramids feel even more real. We are looking at the work of our own distant cousins, and that is the greatest discovery of all.